All right, so welcome to all our viewers. Um, this is your JFK Diversity Committee, and our honored guest today is Nazzshonni, aka Naz, from Sogorea Land Trust. We will be interviewing her to get some more information and to learn and really kind of to just educate ourselves on what their organization is doing, but also to honor our Native American History Month. So without further ado, we'll just kind of get started. Naz, would you be able to maybe do an introduction for our audience?
Sure. Yeah. I know we're all here virtually, but I just want to take a minute to honor the Ohlone people of this land. I'm fortunate to work with the Sogorea Land Trust under the leadership of Karina Gold as well as Janella LaRose. And Karina is the traditional or the tribal spokesperson of the Lishan Ohlone people, and that's specifically for the territory of Huichin, what we know present day, we know it as Oakland, the East Bay, all the way up to Vallejo, further down towards Fremont, as well as the other tribes in this area like Miwok, Pomo, the California natives that we are honoring this month, and everyone throughout Turtle Island.
Naz, can you talk about the history of the Ohlone land that we occupy right now, just in the Bay Area, and maybe kind of where it spans, where it starts, where it ends?
Yes, yes. So I myself, I'm not Ohlone. So what I'm sharing here is what I knowledge I received from the descendants of the original people of this land, and just through my own journey and learning. So the original people of this land being the Ohlone, with many different types of tribal bands, if you want to, like, you can refer to them as tribal bands, or kind of like even like clans in some system, like different types of Ohlone people, and they all had their different dialects. One thing that I've learned is that they were always close by a water source. So oftentimes where you find an area where a creek will meet a bay, that was originally a village. So everywhere that we're walking throughout this country, throughout the Americas, and as well as outside of that, these are all places where Indigenous people created life here. And many of them are unfortunately not here, but we still do have people here carrying on that culture, reviving culture, language, food, diet systems, all of those things that are that people were killed for, persecuted for, and specific to this land. There's just a lot of extractive, like history of like extractive forces, kind of taking away from the life force of people like the Ohlone. So, for instance, just how our nation was founded, how things kind of just took away from these people's lives, and also when we look at factories now and how a lot of people are using these extractive resources instead of listening to the land, giving back to the land. So for the history of like where we're all here in the East Bay and also Oakland, there's a lot that has to do with the genocide of Native people, specifically the Native people here, as well as the invisibility that, like, when we talk about Native peoples, it's just not there. We're seeing now with the election, there's not much talk about Native peoples, and it wasn't until I think 1924 that Natives were able to vote, being a citizen of this country. So that's kind of like backwards, or you come in, you take someone's land, and you're like, oh, here, let me give you the right to be a person, to be a citizen. And we see that with so many other groups of people where some outside force is coming and saying, okay, you're a human now. So yeah, I think there's a couple different things that I could talk more about as far as the history. Was there something else like specific about like where we are today, or practices and traditions?
So going off of like the powwows and just like some of the spiritual things that you talked about, could you get more into depth of like what are some of the religious and spiritual events that Native Americans hold, or like what are like the dances or things that are important to you when it comes to those things?
Mm-hmm. Important to me specifically, I would say dancing. Um, I was a little self-conscious about it, but I still have like a regalia. It's what you wear when you're dancing. Um, and it kind of inspired me to like one day have my own traditional like Dene clothing. Like there's moccasins that are made a certain way. You tie your hair up a certain way into a bun that both men and women wear. And the idea that like a lot of things are sacred, like our head, our connection to the creator. Some that is also shared with many other religions and cultures. The idea that the clothing that we wear, traditional clothing, is sacred. The land that we're on is sacred. Our family members and our loved ones that have passed on. So for me, like the dancing was like my way of connecting back to my tribe and my clan. Um, and I would also say food. So I love food, I love cooking, and I also had a chance to participate in programs like as a high school student, and then eventually lead programs when I went to college, and then came back to the community, leading programs that were centered on traditional diets. So an example is like for the Navajo Nation, we have something called frybrand, and like it's shared like throughout the entire like Native community here. And people love it because it's kind of like fried dough. Like a lot of cultures have fried dough. But the way that that food came about was actually it's kind of like birthed from trauma. So it's like there was all this like surplus of food that the government was giving the Navajo Nation, and unfortunately that was after they kind of put us through like a what was called the long walk, and it's basically just forcing people out of their homelands. And then after that period, I think it was like 3 years after that ended, they were like forced to go back. So it's like so many people had died on that walk from starvation, exhaustion. So many children were left behind. So it's just a very traumatic experience that was kind of carried on with the tribe. And like from that, being put on a reservation, being told, okay, like you're human now, you can have this little box, you can live over here, even though we took this land from you. Out of that came frybrand. And there's this conversation in the community and in the tribe, especially about like, is this traditional? It's like it's been in the tribe for more, I think, more than 100 years or so. But it's like at the same time, this is something that is causing diabetes. This is something that is causing heart disease. It's like made with not the most healthy items, but on top of that, it's like fried in lard, and then like people put all kinds of stuff on top of it. They make it sweet, they make it savory. But for me, it's kind of like it's like another form of like comfort food, and at the same time I'm like looking at it with a critical lens, like okay, our traditional diet had turkey, it had I think they're called prairie dogs. It had beans, it had potatoes, it had I think corn, but that might have came to us through other tribes. And this idea that, you know, people talk about food deserts, but it's like the desert also has food and it also has abundance. It has things that are able to live and sustain people. So like these food deserts are actually like deserts actually has a lot to provide. So there's this whole like ecosystem that comes with the area that we're on now for the Navajo Nation.
What's a common misconception about Native Americans?
Mm-hmm. Can I ask if anyone like has heard one or they think they know one? See Shelby thinking.
I've just known stereotypes growing up.
Oh yeah, stereotypes.
So like a lot of like alcohol abuse, domestic violence, drug abuse, sort of same thing.
Like education to like lower education than some others. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I talked about like intertribal community, like on top of that, there's also rural communities. Oftentimes, some people may see that as like people that are more connected to their tribe or culture, maybe because they're still on that original land or they're on the land that has become a new homeland, even if they've been like forcefully relocated. So unfortunately, on a lot of like reservation areas or like in Canada, they call them reserves, there are not many opportunities. And if we look at our own cities and our communities, like if you're in an inner city, for instance, like growing up here in Oakland, there weren't many resources. So like for me to go into STEM, into study engineering, I didn't have those experiences to go shadow someone to learn like what's civil engineering, what's mechanical engineering, what's electrical. How can I see myself in this role if my community or like whatever, something's in the way of showing me like the possibilities. So I'd say for a lot of reservations, that's the case. There are not many opportunities, and some people are leaving to go find that opportunity. Some people, especially during the 70s, there were a lot of relocation acts that kind of continued that like violent like trauma of pushing people off their land, where the government was like, hey, go to Oakland, go to this place, go here, you'll find a job, that kind of like American dream thing. And people were like tricked into going to these places, and this is why we have an intertribal community here. But at the end of the day, like I was only been like on the reservation a couple times, and I was very young when we were there, when my family was there. But every time that I go back, I notice that there's like this cutoff, whether it's like you can't get internet access, so you're kind of cut off as far as like what's pop culture right now, what's acceptable, what's politically correct. A lot of those conversations aren't happening. And then when I compare like how I grew up versus how my cousins grew up, like I feel like I'm the one that's providing those opportunities to my cousin, because it's like on the reservation, there are not many opportunities. And we can say the same for inner cities, where there are so many different things around you that are like preventing your growth or standing in the way of opportunity. And unfortunately, things like alcoholism and domestic violence and drug use, a lot of that came from colonial powers. If you look at Indigenous societies around the world, like we didn't have that. And we had like, and if we did, like we had some way of like mitigating that. And like we had councils, we had women in leadership positions. There are so many matriarchal societies throughout the world. But something like alcoholism, that was specifically given to the Native people of this land by white people. Sorry, by colonial powers. So it was kind of like, oh, we get them drunk, make them sign this treaty. They don't even understand the language. And now, unfortunately, that's something that has been used as a coping mechanism, has been used and abused like in the community. And at the same time, I'm hopeful that like it will change. I'm hopeful that people are finding those resources, but there is definitely that misconception that like all Indians are drunks or all Indians smoke tobacco. It's like, no, like some tribes don't even like use tobacco. And a lot of tribes, they kind of make sure that these ceremonial spaces, or even on reservations, they ban alcohol and like tobacco. So they make sure that like they're stopping the cycle.
So bouncing off what you're saying about like colonial powers, I was wondering like how did the establishment of Mission San Jose affect the people of that time, the indigenous peoples?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for the mission, I think they were like, excuse me. The thing is, I was homeschooled during middle school, so I don't even remember this mission project that everyone talks about. So I'm like, what happened? Like, so what I get is kind of like learning about it much later in life. And I feel like they were like 70 or like 6. I could be wrong with this number, but it's something that we could like look up and double check. Like 70 or 60 different missions throughout California along our coastline. And in these places, this is where the colonial powers of the time, whether that was, I think like it was between like soldiers, missionaries, and also like just like militia people that were just like taking over the land. They're like, oh, okay, I'm here, so it's mine. But a lot of these missions were places where children, especially young children, were traumatized, where their language was beaten out of them, where they were told that they had to cut their hair, where they were told that they could not speak their language, they could not practice their traditions, they could not pray the way that their parents and grandparents taught them to pray. And something very similar happened for the Navajo Nation that I could speak more on, because that's like the legacy that I am a part of. But from my understanding with the missions, it was really just like using Christianity to force someone else's worldview on the Native people of this land, present day California. And it's something that still has like the lasting effects. So when we're talking about historical and intergenerational trauma, this is definitely something that the Native people, especially the Ohlone people here, are still feeling the effects where they don't know they don't have access to learning their language. They may not be able to practice it. They don't have ceremonial spaces. So that arbor we talked about in over like 150 to 200 years, first one in that amount of time. Also harvesting and foraging, access to acorns, access to materials to create mats, to create structures, like a lot of that was cut off. And another thing that I would encourage you all to look up is like the history and like the story of amaranth and how like it's coming back today, and like people are like, oh, superfood, like, but it's like that's actually a pretty like a great example of like resiliency for the Native community, especially like Central South America, because people were prosecuted for having that plant, for planting it, from holding on to the seeds, yet it's still here.
Going a little bit back to like celebrations, I know like this year Columbus Day was a little bit like more controversial, and I saw like on social media that people had like mixed opinions. So what is your opinion on Columbus Day? And like I know most people know it as the achievements of Christopher Columbus, but I know it can be misinterpreted.
The record, burn it all. No, I'm kidding. And like I don't know, I joke a lot, but like that's what helps me like talk about these things. So my personal opinion, I don't like this man. I don't know why we dedicate this day to him. And then there's a lot of controversy because a lot of Italian Americans and Italian people have pride for this man. At the same time, he was commissioned by the Spanish world government, right? So like it's like, like you weren't even a part of that. I don't like, what did he do other than bring death and destruction? I think there are a lot of other Italian and Italian Americans that could be celebrated, and like we could just move him out of the way, because at the end of the day, like even if you find like pride in like patriotism in the symbol of this man, it's like it's going to mean something else for someone else. So we see that with Confederate memorials, the same way that we look at memorials and like statues for Columbus, and even some of our presidents. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of him. I can't think of anything good to say about him, and I don't think he should be celebrated. I think if you want to celebrate Italian culture, you celebrate Italian culture, and not somebody that killed a bunch of people, raped a bunch of people, enabled others to do the same.
Why do you think a lot of people forget like the real history or choose to like ignore the fact that you were here, like your people were here first, that Native Americans were here first? Like, what do you think? Why do you think people choose to be like, no? Like, you know what I mean?
I think one reason that comes to mind, the people that has like since the start of this country, like the country itself, not like the land and the people here before. I think certain people have had trouble giving up power, being corrected when they're wrong, accepting change, moving forward. And I think we all know who we're talking about. So for those white men that were in power and that may still be in power, they have a hard time giving up that power. They have a hard time letting women come forward. They have a hard time letting Black people come forward. They have a hard time letting Native people come forward. People that may not be able-bodied, people that may come from a different religion or culture or different mindset. And that's scary. Like the idea that like they don't want to give up their power because they want something to control. They want something that they can put their name on, they can brand, they could sell, they can extract. I think that's a big reason. And then on top of that, the environment and like culture that this like terrible history has created is like what white supremacy like stems from, or like what it is white supremacy and like patriarchy, and like a lot of that we, even us in this call, we may find ourselves participating in by letting things happen or by internalizing things, by hurting, like interpersonally, like hurting other people. So it's all something that I think we have a job to do something about. But at the end of the day, like those people need to give up their power. And it's something that we all need to heal from as well.
So in our diversity committee, part of what we do is celebrate different heritages. And personally, I want to know how to appropriately acknowledge Native American lifestyle. And I'm pretty sure everyone here does. So how can people be more educated on and respectful about true Native American culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. These are all great questions, but great questions. I guess to know like the differences between Native American, or like some people like to be called Indian, some people like to be called by their tribe. I would defer to my tribe because it's like I can't speak for all Native people, but I know that there's this shared experience and this shared like identity as well that people can find strength in and people can find solidarity in. So when it comes to like the Indigenous identity, as well as like Native identity, Native American identity, American Indian identity, recognizing that these are all very diverse and distinct cultures with their own languages and practices. So like celebrating those differences, but also celebrating like the shared culture and identity. And asking questions. So some of what we're doing here right now, but also recognizing that not everyone wants to do that work, not everyone wants to do that labor. So like being mindful of that. Don't just be like, hey, you're my only blank friend. I want to ask you questions about blank, blank, and blank. So yeah, this is something like I'm really happy to do for my friends and someone that I have like a relationship with, and I'm happy to like talk about these things with you all because at the end of the day, I want to create more opportunity for young women, especially in this area, my community. But I think one thing is like recognizing that there are differences, and being mindful of like who wants to do that work and who wants to answer those questions. And also being like prepared to like have tough conversations and to recognize when you messed up. So like you ask someone a question like, that didn't really sit right with me, and then like being like, okay, my bad, like I'm sorry it came out that way. Is there another way that I can ask that question? Is there somewhere else that I can go to receive this answer? Do you have the bandwidth? Do you have the capacity right now to answer this question?
Okay, so to continue on that topic, I guess, what's one thing you think that everybody should know about Native American or Indigenous culture or history?
If I could pick one thing, I would say,
That's hard.
I'm trying to think. One thing that came to mind is like appropriation. I mean, it was just Halloween. I went to 2 high schools, but one of the high schools I went to, this girl showed up with a headdress. And I was just like, and my friends were like, what do you think about this? What are you gonna do about it? I was like, I don't blank, blank, blank. I don't know what I said, but I said something because I was like, whatever. I was like, if she wants to wear that and make herself look ignorant and look, stupid and just all this other stuff, that's up to her at the end of the day. But I can't, no, let me stop. My school has policies, so it's like obviously I'm not gonna do what I really want to do, but yeah, just appropriation is terrible. If you want to learn about a culture, like appreciate it, ask questions, go about it the right way. Don't be like, oh, let me be this for a day and then take off the costume, because at the end of the day, like there are people that can't take off their skin color. There are people that can't take away what makes them them. There are people that can't take away who they love.
How can we as like non-native people help like preserve or protect like the land and like educate people with like the little knowledge that we know, or if we see something that we think is inappropriate or ignorant, like you said, like how can we respectfully, as a non-native person, be like, this is not okay?
As far as like interrupting, one thing that I thought of is like, if you're in a room with someone and someone making an inappropriate joke, like bring attention to it. If you see something wrong, like bring attention to it, even if like you feel like, oh, I can't say anything right now, or like I don't know how to say it, just be like, what do you mean by that? Like kind of play kind of like, oh, what do you mean? Like someone makes an inappropriate joke, like, I don't get it. Why was that funny? And I kind of learned that from like when it comes to catcalling and like men being inappropriate. And this is something that I experienced as a young woman, like grown men just like talking to me in a kind of way, and just so it's like something that I kind of had to learn to respond to and like figure out how can I protect myself and like stop that and educate other people on how to stop it. And one thing that I was told is like someone makes a joke that is like just super inappropriate, just be like, I don't get it. What do you mean by that? Have them explain themselves. And once they start explaining themselves, they're gonna be like, oh, I messed up. Like, so I think that's a good way, like interrupting, saying something, even if you don't feel empowered to like speak more on it, just bring attention to it, and then maybe someone else will step in and they'll follow you in that leadership. Another thing, this is related to another question I see in the list, but like how Native people here and like in the US are taking back land and reclaiming land is like through creating like land trust, through working with the government, buying land physically, putting it in their names. And one thing that helps with that is like the thing that we do at the Sogorea is we have a land tax, and that enables people to participate in this healing that we're talking about. It's kind of like the first step along with land acknowledgements. It's like it's only like one step, but at least you're like starting that conversation. And it enables us to provide our programs so that way we can grow and provide medicine to the community, so that way we can do our food distribution, so that way we can buy land and legally have it according to the how society does things now. Something fell over. Okay, it's good. What was I gonna say? Yeah, so like things like Shuumi, and there are a couple other tribes and communities that are doing a similar thing. Things like giving up power and stepping back. Things like speaking up and interrupting if you see something that's like someone is just being inappropriate.
Yeah. So kind of going back to like the land part and everything, what are like some ways that like Indigenous people could kind of like take back their land?
So there, to kind of go off what I just shared, like the conversation, like the topic around like Indigenous sovereignty has a lot to do with like how tribes in intertribal communities are viewed by the government. And that relates to like blood quantum and who gets to be enrolled, who's not enrolled, who's disenrolled even or unenrolled. And yeah, so yeah, so there's buying the land and just putting it in your name, and like how homeowners do. There's occupying land and just taking it back and like, hey, this is ours. We're here to treat the land that it wants to be treated. There's also working with the government. So for instance, like the Navajo Nation, I think people are able to build their own house or kind of live wherever they want, as long as they're able to like spend, I think, 10 years on the land, and you have to do like a survey of it, test the soil, and the government like offers, the Navajo Nation has its own government, so like that government offers it, and like it's through the US government, so that's possible. But it's also really disappointing because it's like there's no practice of sovereignty in there, where you have a whole nation that is like has its own government and practices, but yet you have to check in with the US government like, okay, can we give this one family an acre of land or 10 acres of land. Is it okay if they build their traditional house in this area? Which is pretty upsetting. And then if you're not enrolled, if you're not federally recognized. So if the government doesn't recognize you, so for instance, the Ohlone people that are here, not federally recognized, I can think of like maybe 2 other tribes. In Louisiana, there's a tribe that doesn't have federal recognition, and that's screwing them up because they're basically invisible. And I think even like if you like search them up, the Huma tribe, like it will say that they're extinct, which is just like super disrespectful. And there are still people there. So it kind of pits like Native communities against each other, because like they'll have like the biggest enrolled tribes like Cherokee, like, oh, well, we have our papers, we have this, we have that. So that's one thing that I definitely see as a privilege as someone who's enrolled in the Navajo Nation. Like that's a privilege that I, you know, if my mom didn't think fast and like get it right when I was born, I probably wouldn't have it. So yeah, working with the government, buying the land, occupying the land, and stewarding the land. Yeah, and then federal recognition, as well as like being enrolled, are some of the things that are kind of in the way of Indigenous people practicing their sovereignty.
I'm just gonna piggyback off the topic of land, because I've been seeing this, I guess, maybe it's ceremonial, but a lot more people are actually acknowledging the land like before events, and I think that that's like it's definitely new to me, but I'm Pacific Islander. I was not born in this country, and so I know the importance of like you know, acknowledging the land that we stand on and, you know, where people are from. But more and more I'm starting to see it here, which is like beautiful. How like, is that something, I guess it's a 2-part question. How might a non-Indigenous person do proper land acknowledgement before events? Is that appropriate, I guess, for non-Indigenous people to do it? And then, or how would we find out, for instance, if I'm like gonna take a road trip, like I'd be curious, like what land is this? What land am I occupying? Like, is there a resource or a place to kind of find this out?
I'm gonna post something in the chat that I think you may want to look at later, but you just kind of like spark something where there's a conversation about, you know how like Pacific Islander communities often grouped with Asian, and there's this conversation and like movement towards recognizing that Pacific Islanders are also like Native Indigenous people of this part of the world, part of the Americas. So I posted a link to FUI, and FUI actually, I think they have like journal articles around this in their Tongan. So I was like, that's another conversation. And like when we talk about this shared identity, like we're also recognizing that like people in Pacific Islanders and Oceania, like they're part of this conversation too, and they're going through the exact same things, like very, very similarly as like Native peoples in Turtle Island. And Turtle Island is like basically North America. In the same way that like similar struggles are going on in present day Central and South America, and also like Canada. Sorry, I got a little off topic with that one. What was the question again?
How might like non-Indigenous, non-Native American people, like if we wanted to honor, you know, and wanted to acknowledge the land that we're on, like during, you know, before events or something, I guess the first part is, would that be appropriate? And then secondly, if it is appropriate, how would we know kind of what land we're standing on, and so that we can acknowledge it correctly?
Okay, I'm gonna post another link. So yeah, land acknowledgements are one way of doing that. And I think there's a big shift towards that, and honestly it's something that's new to me too. And when I talked about like resources in the community, like I didn't have that many resources to learn about Ohlone people until much later in life. So the native land map is like a good way of recognizing like where you are, like where you're living and working and going to school. So if you go onto that link, you're able to like zoom into the California coast and kind of see all the different tribes that, as well as like intersecting borders, because borders is not really a like native indigenous way of thinking. The idea that you're like, okay, this is mine, like there are territories, yes, but the whole idea of like borders is just kind of like, we're gonna shut people out because like why? So that's a good way of finding out where exactly you are. And I'd say that land acknowledgements are a start. And I think what it really is just saying like, these are the people that were here before us, and these are the people that are still here, as well as asking permission of the land. That's something that we talk about a lot in our work. While we're harvesting something or foraging, or we're receiving wood from a plant or a tree, we're often like asking permission, like, hey, can I, well, it's kind of like that, like, hey, can I have some wood, or like, can I chop you down and use you as wood? Or like, if a buffalo or rabbit or something gives its life, it's like you're being thankful for that, and you offer something in return. I was told by someone, I think at like the Native American Health Center, the intertribal friendship house in San Francisco. I was told by one of my mentors, like, if you're taking something from a place, make sure that you leave something in return. And I was like, oh shoot, like I took this stick and I took this really, really big, like 6 foot long stick out of a park, and I was surprised no one saw me. And it was like, I need to go back and put something there. So now I practice that. I learned from that experience to leave something in return. So offer tobacco, or like in Navajo Nation, you can offer ground corn. You can offer food, and that's the same thing with like people as well. So if you're going onto the land, asking permission of the land, asking permission of the people that steward that land, like, may I come here, and may I be a guest on your land. At one of our main sites, we do have like a sign that says like, ask permission, area like led and cared for by Indigenous women. So like that's something that a protocol that we've like kind of brought back, where anyone that is outside of the organization, they come up to the front of the our space, they check in with us first. They wave and say hello, and then we come over and we have a conversation, and they're like, can I brought this for you, can we like talk? And they're like, yeah, come in. And that's something that's new to me as well, that I'm learning.
I have a question about like women and their roles in like the Native American community, because I've learned that like in the past that some women have had higher roles than men, because they're the ones who are staying like on the land while the men are leaving to go and hunt or whatever their role is. So could you kind of tell us more about the sovereignty of women in like Native American cultures?
So for like the Navajo Nation, we are a matrilineal society. So everything goes through your mother. And because my dad's one that's Navajo, I have a very interesting way of doing that, where I kind of just like, I receive my clans only through my grandmother and my grandfather on my dad's side. So oftentimes when people say their first clan, they'll say their mother's mother. So when you introduce yourself, you're supposed to say all 4 of your clans you get from your grandparents. So I start with my father's mother. Or actually, I don't start. When I tell people, I just say like, these are my 2 clans, and they're like, where are your other ones? I'm like, well, like it's only my dad. So I do start with my mom though. But usually I'll say clans, and I'll only list 2. And that goes for like things that you inherit. So like whether that's land or horses, animal. So everything goes through your mom. Not all tribes are like this. And then I also said like around the world, you'll see matrilineal societies, and just like some really badass women. And there's also a tribe in like the Northeast, I think. I may be wrong, but it's part of like, they're referred to as Iroquois Nation or Iroquois Federation. It's like comprised of 6 tribes. they all have their own names, and I believe there's actually another name that they use to refer to them, to that group. But one of the things that a tribe in that like group says is like, or the one thing that they practice is that they may have elected a chief or a tribal person, a spokesperson that may be a man, but he's also like appointed by a council of women or a council of elders. So like even if it's not, even if the like the leader or like the face isn't a woman, like it still goes back to your mom, it still goes back to your grandma, your aunties, your mentors. And another thing that I wanted to acknowledge is like some tribes have like if a role isn't being if there's like a role that's open and like we have a woman that is all the children are cared for, and like we have a woman that feels more aligned with their masculine energy or her masculine energy, they would go and take up that role of like hunting like with the men, vice versa with for males and men as well. And that's something that like shows that Indigenous societies have had like different types of gender, and it's not something new, it's not something that was like, it was something that was accepted. And another thing that's shared with the whole like Native community is that they're two-spirit people, and the idea is that it's kind of like non-binary, where like the idea is that this person is kind of aligned with two types of energy, feminine and masculine energy, or two types of genders. So there's that as well. But yeah, there are a lot of like women leaders in like matrilineal societies, and it, I don't know, it just shows like you look at like nations around the world that are led by women, and like they're doing pretty well right now. So that speaks for itself.
Other than online sources or websites, are there any places or organizations that you know of that we could visit to learn more about Native American culture?
Mm-hmm. Are y'all in Fremont, right? Okay, Fremont. That's a good question. You're close to Coyote Hills. They have, right? So y'all been there? So everything in that area, like that like marshland area, that's like kind of like what a lot of people, that was kind of like the environment that a lot of people lived in like 200 years ago. Well, more like 200 years ago, especially like in this area, like how we have Alameda and all that, but real like in reality all of that was marshland. And that was kind of like the environment for the people along the coast in California. So there's like tule there, there's cattails, there's soap root, and I think I'm missing something else. But that's a great place to go because they have a like a community center that is created by the East Bay Parks Recreation or East Bay Parks Association. They actually have like a model of what the traditional houses look like for the people in like Fremont area, but also throughout the coast. And they have a bunch of like cultural resources in there related to plants, animals, practices, housing, and also, well, Sogorea Land Trust. We hope like once it's safe to like welcome people back onto the land, and also volunteer. I also work at, as a part of my work with Sogorea Land Trust, I'm also at the Gill Tribe community, which is in Albany. And right now we're accepting volunteers. So we have a safety training that we're doing to make sure that people are being safe, but that's one way of like welcoming people to the land and staying connected. There is the American Indian Child Resource Center that I'm a part of. We do focus on like Native youth in like middle school and high school, but we also like send out newsletters and resources for the general community to like kind of know what we're doing. Intertribal Friendship House on International in 4th Avenue or 5th Avenue. There's also an Intertribal Friendship House in San Francisco. The Native American Health Center, they are like a healthcare providers, but they do have a lot of like cultural resources as well.
So like I know that like hair is a big deal, or like in some tribes, and like braiding, and I know like the 3 strands like connect you to, I don't, if I forget what the things are, but like is hair and like braiding a big thing in like most, if not all, like Native American cultures, or just like a few?
Think so. I'm not positive, but I think so. Like something like the dream catcher, like it wasn't traditionally a part of like my tribe's culture, but it was something that like through migration and like exchange and like bartering, like it became a part of our tradition. So it's not ours originally, but we received it from the Anishinaabe people, like Michigan up Great Lakes territory area. So it's breeding. I think it's not specific to like a certain tribe, but it's something that like the intertribal community especially has like embraced and accepted. Um, and yeah, so I think I don't know about like specific braiding styles, but I know a lot of people like to braid their hair in like two like French braids or like cornrows back when they're dancing because it's just like, oh, it's easy, get your hair out of your face. Um, yeah, so like I don't know if it's like all around, but like people love it in the Navajo Nation. But then there's also a way that like men and women wear their hair traditionally for Dene people. So like the bun that I was referring to. Um, but yeah, like you go to powwows and like everyone's hair is braided because they need to dance and they need to like have their hair out of their face. But also like for some people, braiding their hair is like a very sacred thing. Um, and the idea is that um, like you do this when you're thinking of positive things, so it's kind of like praying in a way. You're braiding your hair thinking of these positive, so you don't want to do it when you're angry because you're going to be holding on to that throughout the whole day. And in the Navajo Nation, like if you're not immediate family, you shouldn't be touching other people's hair, similar to like touching other people's being close to someone or touching someone that you're not related to, or seeing them like outside of like seeing them in their like lounge clothing basically. So it's kind of like taboo for me to braid another man's hair if he's not like my immediate family.
I just have a question about like items and stuff within tribes. Like I know that people have said stuff about like white sage and about how it's sacred to certain tribes and that like only like native culture should use it. So you could talk about that.
Yeah. This kind of relates to appropriation. I kind of have different views about it. I think if someone we see this with like yoga and other like spiritual practices, or someone's like, ooh, and it's always a white person. I'm sorry I had to say it, but certain people are like, ooh, let me try this cultural thing. Let me try this spiritual thing, or they'll like try a certain drug or something and go into the spiritual journey, and then they're like, okay, let me bring it back to Moraga or wherever. And they're like, let me charge these people so I can enlighten them with my spiritual knowledge. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. And I'm all for people like trying these things and like appreciating culture. But like when you're trying to do something that you're not, it's just like, why, you have your own tradition and culture to honor, like do that. Offer something that comes from your tradition. But I'm seeing that a lot, like with, I'm seeing there's a documentary on Netflix. I can't think of it now, but I just was like, every single episode is like some middle-aged white woman that's like, "Ooh, I found this new journey. Let me profit off of it," and that's not cool. So, if you're accepted by the culture, by all means, people are like, "Hey, you're my family, you're my friend. Like, I want you to be a part of this. Like, by all means, participate in those ceremonies when you're welcomed." But with sage, I don't know. It's like there are different types of sage as well. And I grew up like burning it in the house, not necessarily for like ceremony or like prayer uses. Um, but I think it's something that like I think it's okay to have others have access to it, but like when it comes to selling it, that's not something that we do. When it comes to like profiting off of that medicine, or profiting off of someone's knowledge that shouldn't even be replicated, I think that's where it's a problem.
Is there a specific difference between the terms Indigenous, Native Americans, and American Indians?
Mm-hmm. So I would say like for Indigenous, to me, like that means like you could be anywhere in the world, and this is like your native land. This is where your ancestors originated from, generations and generations and generations back. So for me, like I often use it referring to like indigenous people of this land. But like if I go to like the Netherlands, I'm gonna be like the indigenous people of the area right above here. Those are Frisian people. This is something that I learned about, and I was even trying to like go there and stuff. So it's like I'm gonna be like, okay, the indigenous people of this land are descendants, and they're referred to as Irish, or they're referred to as a Kenyan tribe. They're referred to as Hmong people. So for me, like I use it a lot with like I'm like indigenous people all over the world, but usually like depending on context, I'll be like indigenous people, and I mean like here in North America, or like here right in Oakland, here in the Bay Area. I prefer going by my tribe just because like I don't like use the word American a lot. And Native American I think is more like politically correct, and like people are like, oh, can I call you this? And they're like they feel safe saying that word versus like Indian or something like that. And Indian was more widely like used in the 70s and like around like Alcatraz, and when a lot of people were doing activism. So some people like being called Indian, some people only like when other Indians call them Indian, and some people just like being called Native. Some people like being called California Indian or California Native. So I think it like you have to like ask the person, similar to like a pronoun, like hey, what are your pronouns, or like hey, like how do you want to be referred to? Excuse me. And but yeah, so I think everyone's gonna have a different answer. Like personally, I would go by my tribe because I don't want to be called Indian because it makes me think of like other words. So
Yeah, because I heard that you guys were given the name Indian because of Christopher Columbus, because he thought that he had arrived in India. So I kind of recently I started learning that it could be offensive to some people. So I just didn't, yeah. So that was a question, Alana.
a good point. Yeah, like being, especially if it's like someone outside of that community saying, I'm gonna call you this, like that's not cool either. So like listening when people are like, hey, I prefer this pronoun, I prefer this name, this nickname, or this identifying name.
But yeah, I wanted to just extend my gratitude and to your organization for the work that you do, and then also just you know being able to be in community with us right now. I feel like even though 2020 was a bust in a lot of ways, I don't know that we would have been able to have this kind of interaction if it weren't so there are programs so that there's that kind of connection with the youth.
I personally, I'd be open to it. And one thing that I'm thinking of is like inviting you all to like some of the land that we're on. And like right now, the one place that's like really great for that would be the Giltrap Community Farm, which is in Albany. I know like transportation may be like a hard thing, but at the moment we can't really bring people into other places.
For sure.
There's another space in West Oakland, but that one's kind of small. So we'd have to be like very mindful of like social distancing and stuff like that. So I think that's something, yeah, like you all can like work out with me, and I'm happy to host you. But as
Awesome.
like the main space, like in East Oakland, I think that we need more time before we can start to receive like youth groups again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the work that you do, Naz, and for your time once again. I know this was super last minute and you jumped on. Great weekend. Be safe. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Naz. Hit the like and the subscribe.